So I expect you've all heard the breaking news that the United Methodist Church is going to break up, that there's going to be a schism. As the news services will tell it, primarily we are breaking up over the issue of human sexuality and who is welcomed fully into the life of the church. Now, while basically that is a true statement, there are some other issues that are at stake. Issues such as how do we interpret Scripture? Or how do we understand the balance between the evangelical message and the social gospel? Issues of the colonialism of the United States Church compared to the churches on the continent of Africa and in other places around the world. Our cultural diversity across the globe and in our denomination. Who within the church wields power and holds power. These are just some of the issues at play all around our disagreement about human sexuality. It's extremely complex, just like any other time there's a breakup. But whether it's a divorce of a couple or the separation of an organization or a corporation, there are also issues of money and property, and those issues are definitely at stake here as well. Now, as we know, the pandemic forced the postponement of General Conference a couple of different times, and that makes everything even more uncertain, more complicated, and at some level it's changed the landscape a little bit. But Pastor Will and I are going to do our best to decipher what is happening and to share with you some of the choices that the delegates and ultimately choices congregations will be faced with in the years ahead. We're not sure that everybody is aware how the United Methodist Church is organized and how decisions get made, so here's a quick primer on our current structure. All local congregations are members of an annual conference, 54 in the United States, 75 in Africa, Europe, and the Philippines. All property is held in trust for the annual conference, and that clause that is in every one of our deeds has been upheld in the courts, at least in the United States, so that property, if a church ceases to be the church and closes its doors, the property reverts to the annual conference. Annual conferences are members of jurisdictional conferences in the United States or central conferences internationally. The General Conference is a body that is made up of approximately 875 delegates elected by the annual and central conferences. The membership is distributed proportionally across the globe. Depending on how big your conference or annual conference is, you get more delegates or fewer delegates. General Conference is the one who creates the rules and writes the discipline, and they are the only entity that can speak for the entire church. Central conferences outside of the United States have the ability to amend the discipline for their context in ministry, while United States conferences cannot amend the discipline. There are the Council of Bishops is the group, the collective of bishops, and the Judicial Council is like our Supreme Court. They make decisions as to whether or not rulings and aspects of our ministry are in line with the discipline. And then, of course, there are the boards and agencies of the church that do our global mission for us all.
So just a quick foundation for what's going on in the Methodist Church. Maybe you have no clue, and that's totally okay. The Methodist Church for decades has been determining what is the most faithful way for us to minister with and to the LGBTQ community. Currently in the Book of Discipline, the language, in my opinion, can be harmful to LGBTQ persons. It's at least restrictive and exclusive. It says that LGBTQ persons' lifestyles are not compatible with Christian teaching. That's the language. It does not allow for a pastor to officiate a same-sex wedding, and it does not allow for LGBTQ persons to be ordained in the Methodist Church. And this kind of came to a head in 2019 when a proposal was on the floor that would have allowed all of the different Methodists and all of our convictions to stay in one church while hopefully being in congregations that fit our convictions around this discussion. that piece of legislation did not get voted on, and it was shot down pretty quickly. And so when we talk about the Methodist Church now, we're talking about three main groups: traditionalists, which are those who agree with the Book of Discipline and do not want LGBTQ weddings or ordination; centrists, who may sit on one side or the other but are willing to be part of a denomination that has a broader perspective than their own; and then progressives, who are Methodists who believe that we should ordain and should marry members of the LGBTQ community. So everything I'm going to share today is tentative and could change in the next 2 years, but I think it helps give us a good understanding of what the Methodist Church is trying to do. Also keep in mind that movement is already happening, and also movement is also not happening. Plenty of people are waiting to see what the Methodist Church will do in 2024 to determine what their church or their credentials and ordination will do.
So in 1973, General Conference passed a language in the discipline that says homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And there have been people in the church working to have that language removed or strengthened ever since. We know that right now there are even more restrictive bans on LGBT clergy. We cannot perform same-gender weddings either as pastors or have those ceremonies in our churches, or we're not supposed to at least. And we have not found compromise language or legislation about homosexuality and LGBTQ inclusion, even though we thought that perhaps that had been reached in 2019. The denomination is at an impasse, and there are people prepared to leave from both progressive and traditionalist congregations. So legislation has been prepared to break the church apart. Perhaps could be seen as an amicable divorce. And the General Conference would have to act to bring it about. Due to the pandemic, General Conference 2020 was postponed 3 times, and now it is set for 2024. I'm not going to get into whether that's a good or a poor decision. It just is, and it's what we are going to be working with and living with. It's never happened before in the history of the church that we've had to cancel General Conference. So there are a lot of questions about it, many issues that are before the Judicial Council that need to be decided before action can be taken. First is, should the 2020 conference just be considered canceled, and then we move on to the regularly scheduled 2024 conference? The issue is that the discipline only contains language about postponing General Conference. It doesn't say anything about the ability to cancel it. Postponement means that legislation that has already been submitted remains in place. Cancellation would mean all of that legislation needs to be resubmitted. Postponement means that the same slate of delegates remain in place, and cancellation would say that a new slate of delegates can be elected or needs to be elected. But over the current time here, 4 years, various members of our delegations, their status has changed. Some have died, or some have other circumstances that will not allow them to serve on the delegation. So they're working their way down through the alternate delegates that have been elected. And the way the discipline is worded, if you run out of delegates, you're out of luck as a conference. You can't elect more alternate delegates. Also, a factor is that the world and the denomination is in a different place now than it was in 2019. So why not just start fresh with 2024? And then, not to mention, the jurisdictional conferences need to meet to elect bishops. And some people have interpreted the discipline to say that General Conference must meet prior to the judicial conferences. And others note that the bishops have the authority to call a jurisdictional conference, so some of them are going ahead to do that. The Council of Bishops and the Judicial Council have a lot to sort out, and it's complicated, and that's a charitable statement. Some of the legislation and plans which will be becoming before General Conference in some form have gained or lost momentum over the postponement. So, two things you've probably heard the most about are the protocol for separation and the launching of the Global Methodist Church. And I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Will to share about those areas, and then I will come back with some of the other plans to talk them through.
So the protocols for reconciliation and grace through separation were written in early 2020, back when we thought we were going to have a general conference. And they included over a dozen Methodist leaders from around the world, both laity and clergy, traditionalists and progressive, and centrists. And the goal was to develop a piece of legislation that could be voted on at General Conference as an agreement on how the UMC might move forward, how traditionalists could leave the UMC to start or join a new Methodist denomination, and how centrist and progressive Methodists could remain in the UMC and without causing more harm to members of the LGBTQ community. There are a lot of things to discuss about the separation. Some of them are financial and legal. Some are about the judicial proceedings of the United Methodist Church, and some are about ordination. But before we get into the protocol, I think it's important that we should know that today in our world, there are two Methodist denominations. And there's more than two, but I'm not going to get into that. There's the UMC, which is the church we're all a part of. And it's believed that if current trends and the work that's being done in the UMC continue, that after we eventually have a general conference and do separate, that the UMC will continue on as the centrist and progressive Methodist denomination into the future. We expect that once the protocol for separation is voted on, the UMC will drop the prohibitive language in the Book of Discipline and will allow for LGBTQ folks to be ordained or married within the denomination. Now, there's a new Methodist denomination, the Global Methodist Church, and it's launching this year, May 1st. And that church is going to retain all the restrictive language in the Book of Discipline around ordination and marriage. They even have the celibacy and singleness part that Pastor Don mentioned last week. They claim they are still Wesleyan, and they hold similar structures to the UMC in many respects, but they have a more literal interpretation of Scripture, and the way power is distributed throughout their ecclesial structure is a little different. So this protocol that was written in 2020, set to be hopefully go on the floor in 2024, what does it offer? So it spells out the ways that churches can disaffiliate from their annual conference while keeping their property and their assets and their liabilities, and also allows clergy to leave the denomination if that matches their convictions while keeping their pension and being able to be ordained in the new Methodist denomination. So instead of going through all the multi-layers of Methodist polity, I'm going to give an example of what the protocol puts forward. In the protocol, a good rule of thumb is that whatever the larger ecclesial structure does, you do by default unless you vote otherwise. So here's my example. It's safe to assume, I think, and my colleagues can disagree with me, and they are probably correct, that the Baltimore-Washington Conference will remain a part of the UMC after the UMC splits. It just seems like the Baltimore-Washington Conference is a more centrist and progressive conference, that most churches want to be part of the UMC and be more inclusive of LGBTQ folks. That's maybe an assumption I can't make. I'm kind of new here. Let's say that is what happens, though. The Baltimore-Washington Conference chooses to stay in the United Methodist Church. But I'm part of a congregation, and this does not reflect St. Paul, that wants to join the traditionalist denomination, the Global Methodist Church. If we don't do anything, by default, after a couple of years, we remain in the United Methodist Church. But if my church wants to join the Global Methodist Church, the traditionalist arm, we have to notify the DS, who calls a church conference, have a vote by all the professing members of the church that has to pass either by a simple majority or a 2/3 vote. I think the congregation or the council gets to decide that in the protocol. And then there's a charge conference where that's affirmed. Now, the annual conference can't stop us from leaving, but they do approve it. And so the church has to vote to leave whatever the annual conference is doing. Now, there are some annual conferences that are voting to leave the United Methodist Church. You may have seen that Bulgaria and Romania, which are, I think, a shared annual conference, just voted to leave the United Methodist Church in order to join the Global Methodist Church. So it can go the other way as well. And right now, the reality is some churches have already disaffiliated, some are in the process of disaffiliating, and some are waiting till General Conference, and some have no intent of disaffiliating. I know a few churches that left the UMC early to join more progressive denominations that were already affirming of LGBTQ folks. And I know some traditionalist churches that are already set to join the Global Methodist Church in May. Now, they haven't used the protocol that I just detailed since it hasn't been voted on, and so they had to use what was in the Book of Discipline, which is stricter and usually a little more difficult to go through. So the protocol also commits the UMC to setting aside $27 million as seed money or starter money or just shared money with the Global Methodist Church. Essentially, if the church is splitting, the people who are leaving get some of what the money that's in the UMC. Some of that is paid up front. I think it's like $2 million. Some gets paid later. It also says the UMC will invest $39 million over the next 8 years in ministries of ethnic and racially diverse communities, both in the U.S. and in Africa University. Some of this money is from the money that's going to the GMC, the Global Methodist Church. Some is extra that's coming from the UMC specifically just to invest in these ethnic and racially diverse worshiping communities. Finally, the protocol would put a moratorium on administrative and judicial proceedings that are related to same-sex weddings, the ordination of clergy, and use of funds in the church. In the UMC, if you don't know, we have an internal judicial process that's meant to hold pastors accountable for adhering to the Book of Discipline. And so one pastor can lodge a complaint against another pastor if they do something that's against the Book of Discipline. And so I know a couple pastors, some in Florida, some in other places, who are in the midst of a process of complaint because they officiated a same-sex wedding and another pastor lodged a complaint against them. Under the protocol, if it got passed, these complaints would be paused until after the UMC officially splits, and I imagine they would probably be dismissed after that, since the UMC would probably allow for same-sex marriage after that. And so any complaints around this, including also the ordination of clergy, and I can tell you that in multiple conferences, members of the LGBTQ community have been passed for ordination in the UMC. All of these complaints that would go against them would be paused. They couldn't go forward. So with all this, keep in mind that the protocol has not been voted on. It was written in 2020, and it probably won't be voted on until 2024. And the truth is, the protocol has kind of been losing steam since it got written. It's not that people don't agree with some of the stuff that's in there. It's that there's been some rigidity and circumstances have changed that I think it's unlikely that the exact language of the protocol will be what gets voted on in 2024. It might be the spirit of it. Maybe it's the protocol is the latest iteration of what happens next to the UMC and something changes slightly. But I think this is a good place for us to start and think about what could be next for the UMC and what will happen next, knowing that any of that can change for the better or for the worse. And finally, I'm going to offer just a brief update kind of on the Global Methodist Church. That's the new traditionalist denomination that's launching May 1st. And in the protocol, there was a guarantee that whatever new denomination the traditionalists started would be allowed to have meetings in Methodist congregations with the permission of the bishop and the DS. It was guaranteed they could have those meetings. Currently, the Global Methodist Church is encouraging some churches to disaffiliate sooner, depending on if that makes more sense for them, and others later.
So in response to the launch of the Global Methodist Church, there is no decision that a local congregation in the United Methodist Church needs to make at this time. There is a process in place whereby congregations wishing to disaffiliate from either the progressive or traditional side, if they want to disaffiliate, they can. And that includes the full payment of apportionments for the current year, plus 1 year additional, full payment of pension obligations, and in the Baltimore-Washington Conference, a payment to the conference of 50% of the appraised value of the church property. It also would require a 2/3 vote at a church conference and a 2/3 vote by the annual conference for that disaffiliation to become valid. The Baltimore-Washington Conference is providing a webinar on disaffiliation choices on Saturday, April 23rd, and representatives from the Wesley Covenant Association and Next Generation United Methodist Church will be present and part of the panel discussion. So you may want to tune in on that. The protocol for separation received the most conversation and press leading up to General Conference 2020. So let me share with you some of the details of the other plans which were written into legislation. And here are the names of several which will likely be withdrawn because they have or will receive very little attention. There's the Alaska Plan, which was an alternate plan to the traditionalist language, and the Indianapolis Plan, that was an alternate plan put forth by some moderate leaders in the church. There's the New Expressions of United Methodism, and that was put forward by United Methodist Forward and the Queer Clergy Caucus. There was the Regional Conference Plan, which was put forward by the Connectional Table. But the two I want to spend time discussing with you are the Christmas Covenant and the Next Generation UMC. We're going to start there with Next Generation UMC. Next Generation was spearheaded originally by the Reverend Adam Hamilton, and I'm not sure who the leadership is right now, but I know that the Reverend Ginger Gaines Sorelli from Foundry United Methodist Church here in the Baltimore-Washington Conference is one of the leaders of that group. And here's what Next Generation proposes. It repeals the traditional plan that was passed in 2019, the one that we're currently operating under. It removes the prohibitive language in the discipline with a moratorium on complaints and trials on those issues surrounding LGBTQ rights. It allows local churches to disaffiliate through a date to be determined, with a 2/3 vote of the members present at a charge conference. The annual conference would then set the parameters of the agreement about debts that need to be paid, pension liabilities, apportionments up to 12 months worth. The local church retains their property and their assets and can remain connected to the pension board for clergy benefits. Next Generation allows new denominations to be formed, but the plan does not offer any new predetermined denominations. It allows them to form by the power of the Spirit. Grant money is to be provided in the General Conference budget so that those new denominations might be helped to form. And then those new denominations would determine the extent of their connection and support of the United Methodist Church. The United States would become its own regional conference, and then they would form a commission to rewrite our Constitution and our governance laws. And of course, to do all that, they would need to call a special general conference to approve it once the writing is completed. So the Christmas Covenant was written by United Methodists from Africa, Europe, and the Philippines. And the Connectional Table has now affirmed the Christmas Covenant as an expression of their commitment to institutional equity and to dismantling historic, systemic colonialism. The plan essentially proposes several constitutional amendments and enabling legislation to reorganize all central conferences outside the United States into regional conferences, and to create a U.S. regional conference. Now, constitutional amendments need to pass by an approval of 2/3 of the voting body of each annual conference, and I believe it also has to be 2/3 aggregate vote of the conferences. So Each regional conference would then have the authority to alter portions of the discipline to enable ministry for their context. No regional conference could be forced to do anything against its will. No portion of the church would be required nor prevented from leaving the denomination. Those who wish to to disaffiliate may follow the process that was passed at General Conference 2019, the process we're currently working under. And there are no payments set up to be made to help form new denominations. The plan, the Christmas Covenant, encourages but does not mandate consideration of full inclusion of all persons in the life of the church. So the stance of the committee that wrote it is that this sustains the unity of the denomination, that regional equity is created and strengthened through allowing adaptations in the discipline, and the General Conference can then focus its time on considering issues for a global Christian witness rather than focusing so heavily on United States issues like they do now. Their stance also says that while the protocol is a separation agreement, the Christmas Covenant maintains a vital United Methodist Church engaged in effective mission work that is rooted in mutuality, interdependence, and respect for the missional contexts of each regional conference that it seeks to establish. Now for the big question. What's going to happen? And here's the answer. Who knows? Any of these plans that can be accepted, rejected, or modified. I've attended 5 general conferences as a visitor and advocate volunteer for the Methodist Federation for Social Action. I have seen discouraging, horrendous, unchristian, frankly, behavior. And I've also witnessed powerful movements of the Spirit. Things which seem to be a sure bet going into some general conferences have been defeated, sometimes by a few votes and others by significant margins. So at least for me, I'm done making any predictions as to what is going to happen. Because it truly seemed as if the protocol had the momentum in 2020. But I think the launch of the Global Methodist Church has reduced the energy for that protocol, and perhaps even the need for the protocol. The Christmas Covenant seems to be gaining momentum, and the Baltimore-Washington delegation will be presenting a petition for our conference to endorse the Christmas Covenant, as one of many other conferences. Neil Christie, who is on the Baltimore-Washington staff and has been on the board of Church and Society, has also been a United States representative to the team from the Christmas Covenant. And he believes very strongly that this is the plan that will pass. Depending on the number of disaffiliations to the Global Methodist Church, it seems to me that the traditionalists won't have as strong a voting presence as they have had in previous years. And who knows which set of delegates are going to wind up going to General Conference. But the 2020 delegation was widely seen to be more moderate than previous delegations, even in some of the more traditional conferences. So a lot can happen in a year and a half between now and General Conference 2024. So stay tuned and keep the United Methodist Church in prayer. I want to close today with this passage from Galatians chapter 3, starting at verse 27. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise.